All right, so today I'm going to introduce you guys to all over beaded fabric. This is a couture style sewing technique and video. So I would suggest this isn't for the faint of heart, only because it is a very complex fabric to work with. I would highly recommend sewing on an industrial machine. If you do not own one, by all means, you just need to prep your fabric a lot more meticulously, because in a home machine, if you are sewing any fabric that has beads on it, it is more likely to jam, break your machine, or cause like internal issues, because if any of these shards or any of the beads get caught up into your throat plate or your bobbin case, you're gonna need to make a visit to the technician. But enough of the dark side. On the plus, you end up with this beautiful high-end garment, which is meticulously beaded and crafted to perfection. So this fabric is glass beads. They are bugle beads and Raquel beads with a chiffon backing. And because they are glass beads, they make the weight of the fabric much heavier. So with that being said, because we already know that you can't put this fabric directly into the machine because the beads will break the machine, they'll break your needle. I'm going to show you how to prep it so you can sew on a home machine or an industrial machine. So with that being said, the tools that you're going to need are some pattern weights. So Mood has these in a bunch of different colors. That's my favorite color. You're definitely going to need a fabric scissor that you don't mind getting into a little bit of trouble, because it's going to be tough to cut this fabric. You are going to need a contrast thread because you are going to do some hand sewing. You're also going to need a hammer, which my boyfriend has run off with because he doesn't trust me with it unless I'm using it while supervised. So I will show you that in a minute, how you're going to hammer out your beads from your seam allowance before you actually put all of those pieces together. So we are going to need a pair of fabric scissors that you don't mind putting through a little pain, some pattern weights, contrasting thread so you can baste all of your seam lines by hand, and a hammer and a space that is either outdoors or that you don't mind having a little bit of a cleanup afterwards. So have your dust buster or your shop vac handy, because this is going to be a doozy. It is such a beautiful fabric to work with, and when working with higher end fabrics, you can charge more for those commissions because there is a lot more handwork involved and more meticulous prep with all of your pieces for your final garment. So I'm going to show you a really quick demo using a very small sample, but this applies to sewing all types of seams. I'll also show you a very quick and painless way to put darts into this as well. I highly recommend that if you're making a garment with an all over beaded fabric, that you put as little seam lines as possible into it, because the prep alone for this is going to take hours, but the reward is so great if you take your time. So I'll show you how to prep and cut this fabric, and then I will show you a sewing demo. When you are placing your pattern pieces on this fabric, be sure you know of your grain line. Lucky for me, this fabric is beaded all over, so I don't necessarily have to worry about where I place my pieces, but I do have selvage to selvage, which is the two finished ends of my fabric on the top and the bottom of my table. So I'm going to take, and you see the direction I'm cutting. So this is selvage to selvage, which more traditionally speaking, you would place your pieces this way, but because it's all over beaded, I can get away with placing them from selvage to selvage. Plus, the width of this roll is only 40 inches, so I have to be very, very meticulous with being conscious of where I am placing so that I don't waste any fabric. So I'm going to place this piece here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pattern weights, and you can pin it it's just, you need to be really careful and only use silk pins when pinning fabric like this because it's so delicate. Or you can mark around the edges with chalk and then cut. So I'm gonna show you how to use the silk pins. And this goes for pinning anything that is going to become a garment. You always want to pin only in the seam allowance so that you don't damage the fabric that will be showing on the garment side. So obviously the seam allowance gets hidden away. You can use a rotary cutter, that's at your discretion. Honestly, I recommend just using a pair of scissors that you use for heavy duty stuff so that you don't have to worry about putting nicks in your rotary blade. So now that that is in place, I'm going to trim away. Take your time and make little cuts because there's bound to be a bead that does not want to be messed with. So little cuts, and use your weights to keep everything in place. And obviously if you have anything that has a dart, you would just baste that. You would baste the dart legs, and then you would smash the beads that are inside the dart. So now I'm gonna cut this away just because it's gonna unravel, it's so narrow. So I've got my piece, it's not cut the nicest, but you'll most likely want to have a woven fabric as the lining for this so that you won't have issues with like so much shifting that it ends up altering the shape or the fit of your garment. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my pins. Be a little more gentle than me. And I am going to use my ruler to clear my space because I don't want to, if I use my hand, I'm going to get all that glass in it. So I have my Choco marker with me. And what you can do is you can either mark your seam allowance with chalk first. I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And if you don't want to, if you can just eyeball it, you're more than welcome to do that. And then once you have all of your seam allowances in place, you will baste by hand using your contrasting thread. For those wondering, basting stitching is just temporary stitching. So I'm gonna do like a long running stitch because this is just gonna be a guide for me when I go and I hammer out the beads for my seam allowance. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to sew straight seams, and we will jump into another video on how to sew darts, only because it's a little more detail oriented, and sewing darts on beaded fabric involves a very similar process of basting first. So I'm just doing this basting, or you can call it a running stitch, because I can pull it out later and I won't have to worry about it getting in the way of my actual garment, because we don't want to see that in the end. That's just for when we hammer out the beads, we know where to start and where to stop. You only really need one piece of thread when basting, so that when you pull it out, you don't have to worry about anything getting left over. All right, so I am going to cut and prep a second piece of this so I can show you how to sew it. And when I sew, I'm going to use a contrasting thread just so that you can see it. And I'm going to use a regular foot on the machine and a size 14 needle. You can use a smaller needle if you like, but you need to do like a test sample first. and I will see you guys in a minute. We will prep this by hammering out in the seam allowances, and then we will run to the machine. And again, similarly to our vinyl video, we are going to want to put like tissue paper in between our 2 layers of beading so that the beads don't get caught on each other. All right, so you just have to hammer the seam allowance. Obviously it should be face up, but I want you to see my basting a little better. And wear goggles, please. Flip it to the right side so you can already see that the beads have been broken, but the stitch that holds them to the fabric has not. So it's clean only in the seam allowances. I've got some tissue paper. I have 2 pieces that are cut and ready to be sewn. I hammered out the beads in the seam allowances because when we put this onto the machine, we don't want to catch any beads with our needle. So I'm gonna lay the tissue paper in between the 2 pieces and lay them right sides facing. And I'm only going to use silk pins because I don't want to make any pulls in the chiffon. The chiffon is very delicate, even though it's holding all of the weight of those beads. And you don't necessarily have to pin through the tissue paper, although it makes no difference because once the sewing is done, the tissue paper will become perforated from these stitches. So you can just tear that away, similar to like how we did with the vinyl. And then I'm gonna run to my machine. You're gonna use a regular presser foot, although you can use a zipper foot attachment. And I'm gonna use my industrial machine, so I'm gonna show you on that, because the zipper feet for that type of machine, and by all means, I'm sure that home machines have this sort of zipper foot attachment. You can purchase the zipper feet for the industrial machine that are only for one side. So I'm going to use this guy, and it's going to allow me to walk along my seam allowance, and I won't have to worry about any of the beads being crushed under a regular foot. So if I said regular foot, I was lying. It was a trick question. So now that I have both of my pieces pinned together, I have my seam allowance basted. So after I sew, I can even just pull that out. I'm gonna put this foot onto the machine. I have a size 14 needle, but you can use as low as a 10 or 11, and I'm gonna use regular thread. You can use silk thread. It's just the only issue with that is it has a tendency of snapping because it's so delicate. So you can use cotton thread for this. And my stitch length, I'm just going to use a 3, and I may have to adjust my tension. So I'm going to do some sewing samples first so I can get my machine to the right setting, and then I will sew a sample. So now we're at the machine. We're set with our zipper foot, which has only one side of the machine available. So that means whatever fabric I put on the left side will not be affected by the pressure of the presser foot. So you can see I have my seam allowance here, that's 1/2 inch. I'm gonna stitch right over top of my basting so that I have exactly what I need to sew if I don't wanna rely on the throat plate. And I'm not gonna sew over my pins, you never want to. These are just the methods that have worked for me after lots of practice and experience with evening wear fabrics. So I can definitely promise you that hammering out the beads, the glass beads in your seam allowance, you have to do. You definitely want to have a thinner needle on your machine. If you can get your hands on a zipper foot that allows for either side usage, definitely get your hands on that, and you can use regular thread. So I'm going to use black thread for this. Again, I always want to be sure that I am not 100% on my seam allowance line because the beads are going to create a little bit of space between each layer of fabric. So I'm kind of about 1/8 of an inch, maybe even 1/16 away from my 1/2 inch there. There's so much bulk from the actual beads that I'm gonna have issues if I sew my seam allowance too small. I hope that makes sense. And chances are there's still gonna be beads that I'm gonna get caught on, so I'm just gonna be really slow when I sew, and I'm still gonna back tack. So as you can see, I've started a little bit inside my fabric. My needle is probably 1/4 inch in from my seam allowance. Ooh, that's a little scary. So notice how my fabric, this is good that you're catching this because I'd rather be realistic with you guys about sewing this type of fabric, but I can feel that there is a bead that is getting either caught on my feed dogs or caught in the front of my foot. So I'm just gonna give my fabric a little bit of a boost as I'm sewing it. And that's a broken bead. Okay, now we're making moves. Okay, so that was my only little hiccup, but it's good. I'm glad that I show it because I think everyone needs to see how realistic and not get scared when they're trying this, because it is a very scary experience. And if you get any bits that are getting caught up while you're sewing, you can lift your foot a little bit as you're sewing it just to give that extra boost. Another option, if you are too nervous to start on the machine immediately, you can hand baste the seams and then you can run to the machine, because then you can like double check if there's any beads that are obstructing your path for your seam allowance. On my industrial machine, I have a thigh pedal, so I'm very gently lifting that. And my thread busted. Thankfully, I got the end of my stitch in. But that is part of the trials and tribulations of sewing beaded fabrics. Thankfully, I got a nice, clean, for the most part, stitch. So you can just gently pull the paper out of your seam allowance. And then from the seam side, you can just pull that right out. And as you can see, I still have all my basting in. So what I'm gonna do is from the wrong side, I'm just gonna start to pull that basting out. If it gets caught up on your stitches, you can cut it, but better to be safe than sorry. I'm just gonna gently pull them out. There we go, voila. And then you would run to your ironing board and you can press that seam allowance open. But notice how all of the threads are still there, but not too many of the beads. And if you get any unraveling, you can use what's called fray check, and it is a type of glue that you would just dab on the ends just for safety so that nothing else unravels. But that is the right side of the fabric. And if you have any gaps here, which is okay and probably preferred because as you're sewing you won't get as many obstructions, the beads that end up falling out, you can keep them and you can reapply them into that seam so that it's just like a nice continuous bit of beads. So even if you hammer out too many when you're preparing your seam allowances, that's fine because you can go back and reapply them. And that is how you sew a seam with beaded chiffon